Right, I think we just go. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this exciting session where we're going to be exploring hiring without bias at a very timely time. We've all seen over the past few months how COVID has ravaged through the economy and has changed workplaces significantly. We see the impact that that has on recruitment, the impact on women in the economy, and 865,000 women have left their workplaces in the United States alone. And I think that was, roughly speaking, 80% of the workforce that has left, that was left unemployed during September, which is a very high number. So we'll be exploring today with this lovely panel, what are the things that we can do to ensure that hiring takes place without bias and we keep diversity and inclusion in mind when looking at growing talent within our organization. With some introductions, and I'd like for everyone to say a little bit about themselves and how they relate to this topic. And Colleen, start with you and tell us a little bit about the work at the Gender Initiative at Harvard Business School and the work that you do in this space.
Sure. Thank you, Zara, and I'm really happy to be here. So the Gender Initiative at Harvard Business School has been around for about 5 years, and we are really a hub for all of the research of the school, not just on gender, but really on diversity, equity, inclusion broadly. So we pull in all of that work that our faculty are doing and work to kind of leverage it and get it out into the hands of people who can use it. So we really try to be a hub for the scholarly community at the school, trying to catalyze new research by bringing together our faculty, doctoral students, alumni, practitioners, and helping advance that work itself. And then we also think a lot about how we can get that work out into the world in a way that people can use. So whether that's through events like this, through the media, through convenings that we hold, thinking about how people in positions of power and influence in business and in society generally, how we can communicate with them so that they can take those insights and use them to create change in their own organizations.
Great. Can we move on to Khyati, please? Khyati, as a former founder, can you tell us how you've dealt with diversity and inclusion before and how that brought you to Applied, where you currently are?
Sure. So my background is a bit eclectic. I started off as an economist and then I went into investment banking, which is a highly male-dominated industry, along with other industries. Banking traditionally has a problem of the missing middle. They bring in women at junior positions, but they don't have the structures or interventions that help retain them. And I suppose I was in a similar place where I was starting to realize that barriers for progression are getting less visible, but no less acute. So after 6 years of my career in banking, I decided to vote with my feet, and I went back to school to look for a different phase. And that's how I got into tech, especially tech for good, and what does AI mean for building sustainable businesses. And that was my exposure into diversity and inclusion. And that landed me a job at Applied. And if I connect the dots now, I would say all of my experience prior as a banker, as a hiring manager, as an economist, have all culminated into this experience at this current job. So that's how I've landed here.
Great, really interesting. And Kike, last but not least, tell us a bit about you and the work that you do at BYP Network and how you've got to doing this work.
Yeah, sure. So I run an organization called BYP Network. We connect Black professionals with each other and corporations. So we have about 50,000 members now, and we work with a lot of the large corporates. So like Snapchat, Facebook, Accenture. I think over 200 organizations now have either posted on our job board or gone through larger sponsorship packages. And we also have an annual conference that's taking place at the end of this month. The reason why it started was from my own experiences. So I grew up in London. I did very well academically and athletically as well. So I got a sports scholarship to America, representing the country, A-star student. So I used to get a lot of opportunities, but I then realized that a lot of people that looked like me didn't. So I'd be in rooms where no one else was represented. And then I started realizing again, so, okay, I had to be this athlete with stellar grades to be in the room, but maybe that person next to me doesn't have those same, criteria, but yet they're here because they're like, oh, my dad got me in, it just was very different. And I didn't realize this was the way of the work or the way that the world works until I did. I feel like I kind of woke up to it and felt like this needs changing. as well as just other stuff. It started in 2016 at the back of Black Lives Matter. And just looking around, I just felt like there needs to be a solution for the Black community in general. And I think that corporations have a large role to play because, they create jobs, they create innovative solutions for the future, just like, in terms of AI, right? That's all about the future. And if the workforce isn't diverse, then they're building tech that doesn't include us. So BYP Network was kind of like the solution where if we connect globally around the world, we can come up with ideas, we can join companies, we can refer each other, we can start new businesses, and essentially just be a collaborative group of people that are working to solve, problems within the Black community. So that was the journey. And, in 4 years, it's 4 years on Friday, we've done a lot and we're super excited for what's to come.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for these introductions. I'd like to encourage anyone watching this session to ask their questions so that we can answer them as we go, but we're going to delve straight into it. We know even pre-COVID, recruitment with diversity and inclusion in mind wasn't necessarily great. We've had issues with like Amazon developing a platform where they were looking at kind of using AI to recruit more engineers in tech, and they ended up recruiting more white male Californians to do those kind of jobs because the AI platform picked up on those being the key employees or key skills that Amazon needs. And COVID has added another dimension into that, because a lot of businesses have looked at contracting and kind of looking at how they respond to the pandemic. And in that effort, many have put diversity and inclusion on the back bench, when in effect they should have been putting it at the front bench if they wanted to ensure that they build a business that is more resilient through this pandemic. So I guess my question is, how can companies in the current climate ensure that they continue to recruit with diversity and inclusion in mind and they keep that at the forefront? And Colleen, do you want to set the scene for us on that?
Sure. I mean, obviously there's so much to say, and I'm sure we're only going to be able to scratch the surface in this session, but I sort of like to think about kind of three key processes or components of the process. So thinking about just, sort of the widest part of the funnel, right? So attracting candidates, getting people into the pool who are, going to apply for a role that you have, evaluating the people that come through that funnel, and then finally, negotiating and finalizing the actual hire. And there's so much great research about each of these components and about the ways that biases can influence and shape and undermine, each of those components, and really great sort of evidence-based approaches to preventing that or mitigating that. So I know we're going to get into some more details about that, but I would want to say I think that a lot of the bottom line of the research comes to the fact that greater transparency and clarity is really key to minimizing or mitigating bias. I think when it comes to that widest part of the funnel, there's a lot that we know about how people view job opportunities. And I think we all know, the example you gave, Zara, is great of, sort of the way that these existing inequalities about who is seen as like an appropriate hire for Amazon, right, just are still with us. And I know we all have seen these examples of the way that we use language in job advertisements, right? And so a lot of this is well known now, right? People are, criticizing you don't want to advertise for ninjas or rock stars or these very male typed words and phrases. And so we know that that's problematic, but there's also subtler ways that language can be problematic in that stage of the process. And I would just want to call out the great work of Carol Dweck, who wrote a book called Mindset, which some folks seeing on the session probably have heard of, but if not, I want to highly recommend it because there's some great research that indicates that companies that talk about themselves and about their jobs with what is called a fixed mindset. So it's the idea that people just either are good or not, right? That your job as a company is to look for, the superstars and the brilliant people and just find them and bring them into the company. And this is a very traditional way to hire. But what we know is that there's all kinds of inherent problems with that. But one thing that we also know about that is that tends to skew your hiring pool. So there's some strong evidence that women in particular see that kind of fixed mindset in the way a company describes itself and its roles as a place that will be less hospitable to them. So indulging in that is a way to artificially from the get-go, limit your options. And so what you want to do is really employ what Dweck calls a growth mindset and talk about your company and the people you want to hire with that sort of language, which basically, doesn't mean hiring people who aren't great, but it means framing it around wanting to bring people into the company who are prepared to learn and grow and evolve and help the company do the same, and being on this journey of learning and improving. So that's sort of at the initial outset what I would suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen, I think there was a stage at which we've seen a lot of recruitment happen for a culture fit, which in many instances led to a different kind of fit than companies really wanted, because it was a group think kind of thing, a fit and a group think kind of silos. Kike, what would you say are things to be kept in mind when looking to recruit with diversity?
Yeah, so over at BYP Network, we always talk about recruitment, retention, and reputation. And all three are very, very important. So the recruitment side of things, obviously making sure that they're looking in all the right places. So BYP, for example, we have our own job board, right? So if they post there, then they can get applications from diverse talent. And that's one side, right? Attraction, getting them to come and apply. But actually, is there any point in them applying if internally you have your biases? Internally, you're not thinking, oh, actually, this is going to be a culture fit, as was mentioned. And one thing that we tend to also find with the corporates we work with is that there is a difference between the hiring managers and the diversity managers, right? Where hiring managers are kind of quite like, okay, this is what I want, this is what I need this type of experience. And they're not very open-minded to the fact that actually they may not have this type of experience, but their skill set is transferable. And also, for example, in one company, they might not have that management role, but actually they could be promoted to management in the company that you're in. But maybe as a diverse candidate, they were underpaid, they weren't actually in the position they should actually be in as well. And these things aren't taken into account. So it further perpetrates what's going on in terms of a lack of diversity and inclusion. We also talk about the fact that, some companies have dropped the kind of, you have to be from Russell Group University or Oxbridge. They've kind of got rid of that now, where it's like actually it's open across. Also dropping the kind of, you must get a 2-1 and above. Because there's, again, biases within these universities. There's a UCAS problem where actually they have their own biases. So Black applicants don't get into the universities they want. And then there's hiring problems throughout the pipeline. So if we're saying there's a pipeline problem, and as an organization, you're looking at the pipeline as, oh, this is the only way they can get into our organization, then again, you're further part of the problem. So the attraction side of it is like, okay, use diverse boards, but then why should I apply for your organization? I look online, nobody on your website looks like me. There's nothing about diversity inclusion on your website. I look at your social media, again, doesn't feel very welcoming. I try and look on LinkedIn at some of your employees. Again, no one looks like me, and I speak to someone, it doesn't seem very inclusive. And these things go around. So, people want to apply for your organization if they feel comfortable. And sadly, there is this view that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know, which is sad as a view. But a lot of people of color do feel that way, where it's like, okay, it's not great where I'm working at the moment. I do feel a bit, underestimated, but it could be worse in the next company I go to. And that's really, really sad. So, all these different barriers must be broken down. And I think that with hiring managers, they do need to take these things into account. Don't just cross someone off because, like I said, they don't seem like they're culture fit, or maybe they're not coming from, you have a job that's for marketing manager, but you're like, it must be in restaurants. But they don't have that, but they have something similar. Also feel free to kind of interview them, like see if it is transferable. So, and the retention piece is, again, all about what are you doing internally to make that person feel welcome. But I know that's another question. So, but yeah, I do think recruitment, retention, and reputation are the ways to really solve it.
So many great things to unpick here, particularly around how this agenda is sometimes siloed within the diversity and inclusion kind of headline, and then never actually makes it to the hiring managers or people who take decisions around career progression or transferability of skills. Also, when you talk about skills transfer and how you look within your organization to see how you can create a more agile talent and a more agile workforce that can be more resilient to pandemic. We know that the Prime Minister has encouraged people to kind of look at reskilling this week and identifying new career professions. So I went onto the National Career Service website and I took an online survey, and I could clearly see where it's going because it was asking me very biased questions. And then at the end, it suggested that I move to construction, that I would be really well fit to be a plumber, a house sprayer, or a pipe fitter. So if everything fails with what I do, that is where you'll find me. Khyati, can you tell us a bit more, because you have an online platform that obviously uses tech for recruitment purposes. Can you tell us a bit more how that fits into this agenda?
Yeah, sure. I think because we are focusing on startups and scale-ups here, I think it's important to acknowledge that enough and more has been said about the economic and business rationale for greater diversity, be it gender or otherwise. But what we often forget that there is more innovation, more creativity when you bring in a diverse workforce. We, as humans, cognitively work harder when we are with people who are not like us. And for startups and scale-ups, this is really, really valuable, because the next 100 or so humans you would bring into the organization, they could either make or break it. So I think there is a bigger piece for startups and scale-ups, which is more intangible, is what your values are as a company, and whether that relates and translates into your hiring processes. So when we look at companies, we do make an understanding of what are the values. Is there an overlap of ethos? Do they really want to solve the problem, or is it a checkbox item? Because that might be the case with lots of companies, right? And small companies have less fat, and it's just harder for us to make or change a decision that has proven wrong in hiring. So what we'd recommend is, firstly, bake it in your values. If you want to focus on diversity and inclusion, bake it in your values. And step 2 would be stop making the biggest mistake that most people do in hiring, which is they hire on gut, or they hire in a way that is not data-driven. So I can talk about our platform and what it does, but I don't know, Zara, if you want to keep that for later.
Do you want to talk? Yeah, do you want to focus a little bit more on how this platform is built to remove bias and how you remove bias from the recruitment process?
Sure. So Applied is essentially a part diagnostic, part predictive tool. And it's based on the premise that bias lives in our gut. We are all biased, so it's very hard to train bias out of our systems. And therefore, we need interventions and structures that help us take decisions, but guardrail decisions. So how we do it is, firstly, we anonymize to remove bias. For example, knowing my name is Khyati doesn't tell you if I'm a good CEO or not, so why should you care about my name? But Applied is much more than blind recruiting. So if you remove if you remove the names, and then you're left with the piece of paper that people use to judge candidates, which is the CV itself. And we interrogated whether the CV is a most predictive tool to be using for judging talent, and it's not. There's mountains of evidence which says it's not. So we replace the CV with real world challenges that candidates expect to face on the job. And that has a double benefit. That removes things that doesn't matter. If you look at studies that go back 20, 30 years, there's a leaderboard of things that are predictive for talent, and every piece of information that is on bold, that is sat on a CV, things like how many years have I worked, whether I've worked at Google, whether I've gone to a Russell Bracket University, all of that is not predictive of whether I will be good at this job. So we remove all of that. So that's the first benefit of removing the CV. The second benefit is you'll find people outside the mold. You will find people that apply to the job, even though they don't look the part, because they're not constrained in what a good CV should look like. So that's the very first step. Then we account for multiple cognitive biases in the entire process. And I'll give you a few examples. For example, we all know there is serious halo effects. So if I'm a hiring manager and I rank you as really great on skill 10B, I would automatically assume your expertise on skill C. That's how my brain works. And research says that we should chunk up applications. So we can't draw one line through Khyati's application. It also reduces cognitive load when you're comparing like for like. So you should actually compare question 1, or these real world challenges, as we call it, from candidate 1 against candidate 2 against candidate 3, because you're comparing like for like. Another really important bias that creeps in, which is really hard for humans to identify, is something called ordering effects. Now it's 5 p.m. in the day, you've got a pile of CVs. You look at the second candidate, you score them X. It's now 7 p.m., 2 hours later, you're looking at the 102nd candidate, you will score them harshly. That is just how we operate. So we randomize in the app and in the algorithm to prevent for such biases. And all of these, there are lots of other biases that we mitigate for, and all of this is done behind a button to make it super easy and efficient for users. There's the other piece of the puzzle as well, which relates to some of the conversation here about attraction. We do help you write more inclusive job descriptions because all of the research is borne out by experiences. Women normally don't put themselves forward. Women will wait to comply with all of the items on the checklist. So if they don't comply with less than 90% of the requirements, they will not apply for the job. So in a sense, we're saying improve your job descriptions. Don't ask for 1,000 requirements in job ads. Put up salaries transparently because we know women don't negotiate. So all of these tips and tricks are built into our job description analysis tool. And so those are the two kinds of ways we mitigate for bias. And when we do this, we've been able to prove across the thousands of people who have been hired through Applied, one, they wouldn't, 60% or so wouldn't have been hired if you had just looked at their CVs. And that's because we've run a validation study time and time again. And that's the number that's proven to be the pile of people whose CVs would have gone in the bin. And it just so happens that you find the right person for the job, which is quality. They'll probably be different to what you expected. So the person walking in 6 months from the door into the door will be different to your expectations. So that's diversity and all forms of diversity. And you would have saved overall time because we apply the most predictive assessments up front. We're asking you not to use the CV up front, which is the least predictive assessment. So that's what we do, a whirlwind tour of what we do.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I couldn't agree more that the CV is definitely not the right tool to be recruiting talent in the 21st century, because it speaks about what you were good at in the past and tells you nothing about how this person is going to be adapting to an ever-changing economy. I mean, we've all seen how since February, things are changing every day. I don't know about you, but I wake up in the morning and I'm thinking, what next? So obviously, it's really important to overcome biases in the recruitment process. How about biases in advertising the job role and how we attract talent into looking at those roles? Kike, do you want to talk us through a little bit through this?
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, I mentioned earlier about attracting talent, right? But when it comes to retaining talent, you know, I always talk about the company culture. So one thing, again, with BYP Network is that we are quite involved internally with the corporation that we work with. So like their Black networks, for example, are involved with BYP Network. We recently just got a testimonial from Deloitte that after our conference, they actually set up their own Black network because they never had one before. And that's the kind of the power that we use, because for us, we just feel like, again, my own time within organizations is, you know, I might be the only Black person there, or there might be another one on another floor, but we can't even find each other and we feel quite alone. So if I'm feeling alone and this is happening across multiple organizations, we need to find each other and we need to connect. So organizations themselves, they need to do a few different things. So enable that ability to have those different networks and those different groups. And again, people are invited that don't look like them, right? So like a women's network, you know, there's normally a male sponsor, or there's, you know, there's people that, there's men there that are like, you know, I've got sisters, my wife, that's why I'm part of the network. And it's the same for Black networks as well. And also at the same time, I think sponsorship is very important in these organizations. So for example, if I'm here, I'd like to get to senior management, there's no one in that organization that looks like me. How do I get there? How do I feel like I can get there? And you know, we always talk about trailblazer versus you can't be what you can't see, right? But some people do need to be that trailblazer because there isn't enough Black senior leaders or leaders of color. So having a sponsor within the C-suite or the board really does help the progression of talent, right, of diverse talent, because they've got that person in the room who's maybe bringing up their name, who's giving them insight, and they can bounce ideas from and learn from. I mean, on my journey, I've had a lot of mentors, a lot of coaches, and they're very important. Like, that's part of the journey. So when it comes to retaining talent, these are things they need to see, and they need to see that kind of, you know, like with their hiring, with their managers, their line managers, they tend to be the reason why someone would leave an organization, right? So if your line manager is, you know, there's microaggression, or they don't believe in you, they're underestimating you, they're giving you work that, you know, is just to cause you to fail, that's when people leave. And we have so much insight from our community. People leaving jobs all the time, people not feeling happy, and people just feeling kind of like, just feeling like, why am I even here? We even had one member say, that's it, I'm moving out of this country because I just can't take it anymore. And these are the challenges that we see. And it is hard for me as a founder to kind of hear this feedback, but then it's also that motivation of why we need to do what we're doing. And I think that, again, when it comes to retaining talent, what are you guys really doing? It's not enough to have a tick box like, oh, look, we've hired this, one Black person or one woman. Look, if your culture is not ready for diversity, it won't retain it, and it'll even just be worse and worse and worse and worse. Again, someone in our network was talking about how their company, all the people of color were in back office, for example. They weren't allowed to be client facing, as in it was a well-known rule. And again, these are things that do happen at organizations, and it is sad and it is scary. But talent won't stay if the environment isn't conducive for them. So they do have to work on that company culture.
Absolutely. I mean, there's I think two sides to this coin. There's the creating the company culture and the organization to be inclusive and to be receptive of this diverse talent. And there's also kind of supporting and encouraging talent to go for those jobs and go for those opportunities. Yeah. Colleen, from your point of view, what can be done to ensure candidates who are usually less prone to going for certain jobs actually go for them and are treated fairly compared to candidates who then negotiate more or get more out of a job offer?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much great suggestions and insights have already been provided. And, so I think building on that, I think what Kike was just saying about what is the nature of the company that you're hiring for, right? So, I mean, as I remember starting off, Khyati mentioned, in finance and also in many other industries, right, you have the problem of that missing middle, right? So you bring people in, and then sometimes you're also able to kind of maybe bring selectively a few people into the top. So it looks like, oh, right, we've got, our kind of high profile hire who's not, a white male, but then there doesn't seem to be anyone in between, right? And it's because that culture is not actually conducive to people that you're bringing in at the entry level, growing and evolving and being able to move into leadership. So, I mean, that's one thing, right? I mean, people, I think especially today, are really attuned to trying to suss out what is the kind of culture I'll be joining. And as I was saying, one of the subtle signals that we know about is the extent to which you have this growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. That's just one example, but there's all kinds of ways that, people who are looking potentially to join an organization are trying to figure out, is this going to be a place where I actually can, succeed and being able to succeed, not, as Kike was saying, maybe be shunted into, some really marginalized roles, right? As often happens with people of color, there's a lot of studies on this. So I think that's, one really important thing. I think what Khyati was also saying about just, I love the phrase like creating more guardrails, right? Because it's about creating structure and clarity. I think, she pointed out also one thing that I always think is important to emphasize. Not only does, less clarity and transparency tend to, mitigate against diversity and inclusion and equity, but it's also just really bad for predicting outcomes, right? So unstructured processes are just not good at enabling you to bring in people who are going to be successful, regardless of these other issues. So I think that's just one thing I think is really helpful to flag. And there's decades and decades of research showing that. In terms of kind of that final stage of negotiating and the fact that people are often not treated equally in that process, I think it's very clear. There's a lot of research on negotiation, particularly with regard to gender, and all the findings really point back to this underlying theme of the more transparency and clarity you have, the less bias and the less skewed outcomes you're going to have. And there's different reasons for this, right? One is, the fact that, bias on the part of people from the company doing the negotiation is more likely to seep in when there are fewer guardrails, right? Because biases are basically mental shortcuts that we make, right? So when there's, when there are fewer parameters, we're going to rely on our biases, whether we realize it or not. And others, right, are just going back to, the embedded inequalities in our society and in our network. So if you have two people who are, maybe negotiating an offer, similar offers, and the company isn't telling them anything about what the parameters are, what's up for negotiation, what's the range, one person who maybe happens to look a lot like the people already at the company is, not unlikely to be able to have some information the other person doesn't, right? So they may have their friends say, hey, just so you know, it's pretty common practice for the initial offer to be about $10,000 less than what they're prepared to ultimately settle on, right? And so you have that disparity of information. Of course, that's going to lead to unequal outcomes. So I think the bottom line there is you need to let candidates know what's up for negotiation, what the parameters of the negotiation are, and also be explicit that negotiation is either expected or it's not, right? Because we know that people approach that differently and people have different expectations. So if you expect people to negotiate, you need to actually signal that rather than just rely on, kind of these embedded inequalities that we know exist.
Yeah, absolutely. You've mentioned some really interesting things around structure and clarity. And sometimes when you're a scale up, that's exactly what's missing, structure, clarity. Kike, do you want to talk a little bit to this point in terms of when you're growing fast and you're scaling fast, how do you put those structures in place and how do you ensure you keep diversity and inclusion at the forefront?
It just has to be at the forefront, essentially. A point was made earlier that during this pandemic, actually diversity inclusion went to the back burner. And I did see that initially, especially before Black Lives Matter movement happened, which was quite interesting. So some of these companies kind of letting go of their chief diversity officers, letting go of just in that whole department in general. And then obviously Black Lives Matter happened. And then these companies were kind of releasing statements and, putting out targets. So anyway, that's a whole different topic. So it just has to be forefront. And so you're hiring quickly. So that doesn't mean just post in one job board area or ask for referrals only in your team that already looks like you. It means actively looking for different places where you can find talent, right? Like I said, there's BIP job board, but there's other job boards. There's Stonewall. There's so many other job boards where you need to make sure you're spreading across. And then internally as well, again, are you ready for that? If you are a white man and you've hired all white men and everyone's just, has everyone got the training that they need? Are they aware of the importance of diversity? Are you sure it's not just a tick box exercise? I think ultimately we know that the reason for diversity is that it does lead to better results. It leads to, better ideas. It's not that groupthink. And it even leads to opening up of new markets at times as well, because, I think one of our clients, they hired more Black women and didn't know about the Black hair care market. And that led to a whole new revenue stream for them. And it sounds so, like for us, it's like, okay, yeah, obviously the Black hair care market, but there's a whole group of people that don't know about it, right? So for us, for these companies, it's like actually have it in mind all the time and actively go out and look for it. I mean, we supply handbooks from Tech Talent Charter, and there's handbooks on how to hire diverse talent. So whether it's, again, recruitment, attraction, retention, but also, again, making employee networks, going to things like this. There's so many conferences, there's so many webinars, there's so many blogs. It's out there. So for us, it's like if you're not hiring diverse talent, it's because you actually aren't trying to. I really do think it's just that simple. And we wrote a Forbes piece just a couple of weeks ago, literally about the fact that there is a lot of talent, diverse talent, but companies just don't seem to, they're not looking, or they're saying, oh, it's very difficult because they're only looking at their network. So I do think it is a very proactive decision, but it's about understanding that initial investment of time leads to the great rewards of having this kind of very diverse group of people working for you in these ideas. So yeah, the answer is just keep it front and center. Don't put it to the back burner and think it's not going to help your company.
Absolutely. I mean, the number of times we've all heard recruiters say that there isn't any female talent or Black talent out there is, if we had a penny for every time that happened, we'd probably be able to scale our businesses without venture capital. Khyati, speaking from your experience, I mean, you're building a platform for unbiased recruitment. For Applied as a scaling company, has it always been a smooth journey?
Well, unsurprisingly, we use our own product to hire everyone in. So in that regard, yes, it's been a little bit easier. And well, this is my second company running as a CEO. I can talk about the mistakes I made as a previous founder of a startup. But at Applied, yes, it's been quite smooth because we have a D&I strategy in place. We have baked it into our values, as I mentioned before. We drive those values day in, day out. And our hiring processes are transparent. they are structured, they are data driven, to the granularity of we could look back over the last year and see which questions have been asked by which people in the company, and do those questions create adverse impact against certain sections of society. So for us, it is bread and butter, and we would like to inspire others to do it. So therefore, yes, I would say it's been smooth for us in the hiring department.
Yeah. Very, very important issues to kind of live the values and embed the values. And the number of times I've seen company strategic reports that mention women or people of color in just a little segment, a little paragraph somewhere, and then they're not mentioned at all in anything else that the company does, and not mentioned in forecast, not mentioned in recruitment projects, not mentioned anywhere else. But there was the tick box exercise, and that they have been mentioned in that diversity and inclusion section. So definitely scope to, if we want to make this sustainable, to embed this across all the organization. I know we're running out of time, and so I think what would be great is to have everyone kind of go around and give you top tips for how companies and how organizations that are watching us today can include diversity and inclusion and non-biased recruitment as part of what they do. So Colleen, would you like to give a go?
Sure, this has been great. So the number one thing that I would really want to encourage companies to do is to educate everyone, particularly managers, people in decision-making roles, about why this is important, what is the nature of kind of these biases and inequities, because I think that's really essential to being able to actually leverage the power of tools like Applied, or working with organizations like Kike's, right, to actually be effective. Because you can do all of this great stuff, but if people aren't really bought in and don't have a shared sense of why this is important and why this matters, and don't feel kind of accountable and empowered, you're going to be limited in what you can do. So, and again, there's lots of great research on this, but I would really say, to educate everyone and develop a shared narrative around why this matters for your company, so that everyone in a decision-making role can feel really bought in, and feel really accountable, and feel like this is really part of their job.
Yeah, excellent points. Khyati, do you want to give your recommendations?
Yeah, if I had to choose only one thing, it would be start with structures and start with data. So if you could structure your process and map your current process. The example I always give is, if you were a founder or a business leader and you asked your marketing managers, tell me which PPC campaigns or tell me which ad campaigns are working, and they'd come around and tell you, I don't know which ones are working. What would you do as a business leader? It's the same for hiring, right? You need to understand which processes have worked in the past. And if you don't have that data and you don't have those structures, you can't get to the next stage. So just start small, start with mapping out what your current process looks like, and start gathering data on it.
Yeah, excellent points around data. Kike, how about your suggestion?
I agree with both. Very good suggestions. I think what I'd add on top of what they've already said is, again, go everywhere. Like, don't just rely on yourselves in order to solve the problem. Yeah, there's BYP Network, there's Be Applied, there's, like I said, there's women's networks, there's Facebook groups, there's LinkedIn groups. There's so much resource online, and you don't have to rely on yourself. The same way you spend that £10,000 on a pool table or meals and entertainment for everyone in the team, is the same way you can put that money to finding diverse talent. So I think it is that proactive approach and understanding why it is important, but then it goes back to them having to understand that. I think someone just asked a question about the fact that people were letting go of diverse teams, or the diversity team, during the height of the pandemic, and they saw that as least important, when actually that was the most important time to have it. And I think that how we're holding them accountable is, sadly, in this era, companies are just being shamed now. That's really the truth. There's a lot of employees that have become like employee activists, where they speak out and speak up about what's going on internally. So we've seen a range of companies be shamed through this period. And you don't be that company, essentially. And that shouldn't be what motivates them. But sadly, that is what has motivated a lot of companies into action. And so for me, it's like, actually just be proactive with it and understand, okay, we do need to solve this. Let's bring in that consultant that can help. Let's use that job board, or use that community, or use that network. And let's try. And again, measure and see what's successful. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for your brilliant insight.
I think what we're taking away is that now's the time to put diversity and inclusion and an unbiased recruitment in the driving seat. If we really want to build businesses and companies and workplaces that are really fit for the 21st century. Thank you very much for your time. It's been great to have this conversation. I'd encourage everyone to network with others and meet as many other women founders as you can, learn, grow, and keep in touch. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. This was great.
Thanks.